Everyone got quiet, so I guess it's time to start. I'd like to welcome you all here. Thank you for coming out. I know this was a rescheduled event, and there are a number of other events, competing events you could be at. This evening, in fact, has a bit of a history behind it already. I contacted Lorene Cary on behalf of College 130 Coming of Age in America course and the Kirkland Project only in August, which is pretty late to try to arrange something that we wanted to plan for December. It was a long shot, but we thought, well, let's just give it a try. And to my great surprise and delight, she agreed to come quite readily, and we managed to work out a date, September 13th, as you recall. It was a bad week, and she literally could not make it. We tried a number of different things. She was waiting day to day. She wanted to do it. She wanted to get here. She even briefly, according to her agent, considered driving here from Philadelphia. That was above and beyond the call of duty, I think. So we greatly appreciate her coming up here and finally getting here tonight. Lorene Cary, let me tell you a little bit about her. Lorene Cary graduated, as many of you know who've read her autobiography, Black Ice, from St. Paul's School in 1974. She received her BA and MA from the University of Pennsylvania, where she's currently a lecturer in creative writing. Her first book is Black Ice. She's written 3 books, which is, for those of you who are not familiar with it, is an autobiography of her experience at St. Paul's, where she was one of the first women admitted to a previously all-male, and still when she was there, primarily white and upper-class school. And she was none of the above. She has since published 2 novels, The Price of the Child, about the Underground Railroad in 1995, and Pride, her latest novel, in 1998. All the books are available up here afterwards for purchase and for signing, provided by bookstore in Syracuse. So please join us here afterwards. There's also a reception afterwards provided by Cafe Opus. Let me thank them. Let me also thank the many sponsors of this event, but first and foremost the Kirkland Project, who provided the bulk of the financing and all of the administrative work to make this happen. Prior to her career as a novelist, Lorene was a writer or editor for Time, TV Guide, Newsweek, and also wrote freelance in a number of publications. She's won a kind of exhausting list of awards, including the students in the room, which is most of you will appreciate, the Provost Award for Distinguished Teaching at Penn a couple of years ago, Theron Fellowship to study at Sussex University in England, a Pew Fellowship in the Arts, Shirley Chisholm Award in the Humanities, and 3 honorary doctorates in Humane Letters. She is also founder of a new project started in 1998 called Art Sanctuary, a lecture and performance series that brings exceptional black artists and thinkers to speak, perform, and do workshops in the inner city in North Philadelphia. The faculty of College 130 initiated inviting her primarily because now our class has read Black Ice, her powerful biography of her her years at elite St. Paul's. It's both, I think, a powerful statement of the problems and difficulties faced by any outsider at an institution such as ours. This was a high school, not a college, but similar. And as well as a humane and loving portrait of the transformative possibilities such institutions contain. I thought I would, as a way of introduction, classic way of introducing a writer, to read 2 brief passages that particularly struck me and I found particularly powerful in Black Ice. The first, a commentary on St. Paul and places like it that I think is very appropriate to read in our lovely chapel here. Just after she's arrived at St. Paul, for those of you who haven't read the book, she's meeting a lot of the other girls in her dormitory, and it's unclear, first few days or weeks of her time there. As they came to sit and stay, however, differences emerged between us. Taken together, these girls seemed more certain than I that they deserved our good fortune. They were sorry for people who were poorer than they, but they did not feel guilty to think of the resources we were sucking up. Forests, meadows, and ponds, the erudition of well-educated teachers, water for roaring showers, heat that blew out of open windows everywhere, food not eaten but mixed together for disgusting fun after lunch. They took it as their due. It was boot camp preparation for America's leaders, which we were told we would one day be. They gave no indication that they worried that others, smarter or more worthy, might at that very moment be giving up hope of getting what we had. A second passage shows the, I think, humane and humorous side of this autobiography, which in some ways is also very powerful. On her first visit home, after beginning at St. Paul's, she brought a friend with her that she'd met there who was Japanese, also in her first year there, who had apparently given her telephone number to a young man who also lived in Philadelphia. And this is the voice of Ms. Cary's mother. "If that child thinks that I'm letting her waltz out of this house with some Puerto Rican from North Philly, she'd better think again." "Oh, Mom, he's not some Puerto Rican," I said archly. More and more often, I found myself mortified by my family's lack of third world unity. "He's a guy who goes to a prep school, just like we do." "I don't know him. I promised that girl's parents that I would be a mother to her just like I'm a mother to my own children. I tell you what, I would not want anyone to let my child go off in some strange city with some strange man they never even met. That is not my idea of looking out for a young girl. And besides," she continued, "let me tell you one thing. Some of the weirdest people I know are educated people. Why? I don't know. But the fact that he's a preppy doesn't mean a damn thing to me. I am not impressed by education. He could be even crazier than he would have been had he stayed home in North Philly." Ladies and gentlemen, I present Lorene Cary.
You know, we know as a writer that context means everything. So the fact that Steve Orvis ended his introduction right there seems to give some indication that I'm likely crazier than if I had stayed home in West Philly, which could be true. Thank you very much. Thanks for this invitation. I'm very grateful to be here. Now, I actually like to start with a bit of a reading, and I hope it's all right with you. I know they tell me that you've read Black Eyes. I know you say you've read it. But I'd just like to start with a section that seemed very appropriate for September, and I think still has some bearing because it still is early in the term. The first night service took place according to tradition on the first day of each term since the 19th century in the old chapel. The old chapel was built in the shape of a cross with smooth pews in the three lower segments and high-backed seats along the walls. The pulpit stood where Christ's head would have hung if he, in his gaunt passion, had been nailed to this most charming symbol of suffering. Unlike the grand new chapel, this church was small and homey. It did not dwarf or intimidate us. The rector appeared in the pulpit, shorter than he had seemed in the rectory and businesslike. I heard him, despite the close intimacy of the chapel, as if he were speaking from far away. Yet even from such a distance, his words, the content of them, if only I could take them out of that solid white voice, but I could not quite. The content had everything to do with me right then. He talked to us of our fears and our dreams, of our new career, and the challenges of our life together. Then he spoke of tradition. Boys had come and gone before us, sitting in these same pews, thinking and feeling these same thoughts and feelings. They'd grown into men and gone out into the world prepared by a St. Paul's school education to do something worthwhile. My own voices were talking back to him. And so long as he spoke, I could not control the dialogue. Part of the tradition, my eye. I was there in spite, despite, to spite it. I was there because of sit-ins and marches and riots. I was there, and this I felt with extraordinary and bitter certainty, as a sort of liberal-minded experiment. And hey, I did not intend to fail. I remember yawning and yawning, sucking in air with my mouth closed and my face taut. Finally, I gave up the effort to pull in his faraway voice. I let myself drift into the silence. I watched the old dust settle in the red and yellow and blue-tinted sunlight. A faded semicircle of ornate print above one window reminded us of boys who played in the streets of Jerusalem. In this You know, you talk about these old St. Paul's boys. Sometimes they get a little mad. In this close, cool chapel, I could not imagine Jerusalem, its noise, or its sun. I could not imagine anything. But I knew now what they wanted. The words above the window said, "No boy shall leave here unimproved." When the doors opened, I pressed through them into a wash of cool orange twilight. I took off my shoes and was surprised by the wet grass and the freedom to run through it. I ran across grass, asphalt, and brick, past the round post office, the art building over the bridge. It had been selfish of me to ask them to stay. Daddy would have to drive 8 hours tonight. Mom would be tired. Carol had had it. I felt a stitch in my side. They were waiting at the car. My mother looked at me with dramatic maternity. We were back to baby names and to the familiar fury of the separation I had dreamt of. I heard my sister wail, but I could not see her past my mother. I hugged my mother and my father in the moist air. My cheeks were wet from their kisses. I hugged my sister and felt the panic in her small, perfect body. The soles of my feet throbbed from the bricks. "Don't stay here in this place," Carol cried. "Oh, aren't you going to come home? You can't just stay here." My parents got her into the car, and in those days before seatbelts, she flailed around in the back seat as I walked my mother to the passenger side. I was sick with my betrayal of Carol, ashamed that I begrudged my parents the thin shreds of devotion I dredged up and flung their way. I did what I needed to do. I said the things they needed to hear. I told them that I loved them. I told them that I would miss them. It was true, and it was enough, after all. They drove away slowly. My mother looked back and waved. My sister cried and cried. I watched her face and waved to it until it was no more than a speck, until they turned the corner and were gone. I wanted, in writing Black Eyes, to do something. My husband, who is from Iowa, from a very small town in Iowa, told me that going to boarding school was a bizarre experience for any American. He said it's really weird, and if you're going to write about it, you have to get other Americans into it, because it's kind of funny, it's kind of strange. So I wanted to write a book that people who had gone to that kind of school would recognize and not be bored by, and at the same time that people who had no interest in it and who thought of boarding school like a Haley Mills film, basically, so that those people would also be interested and think that this was a worthy thing to read. I'd like to say that I'm not an expert on education. I teach, I've always taught, I probably always will, on the side, bits and pieces, all kinds of courses. I've created courses, I've done some curriculum, but I'm not an expert. I'm an alumna, I'm a friend, I'm a person who went to a school and found myself having to understand through my own experience what the school led me to, in the words of Du Bois, W.B. Du Bois, in his Souls of Black Folk. I learned there a double consciousness that Du Bois defined. He says that the American Negro is two warring souls within one dark body whose dogged strength alone keeps him from being torn asunder. And he talks about living in a world that looks on with amused contempt and pity. But you're of that world at the same time. I started understanding this double consciousness at St. Paul's School. One of the ironies I always felt was that had I stayed in my public school, I would never have gotten the chance to read Du Bois, right? Nor would I have had such an intense experience of this double consciousness in my early years. The importance of that first moment impressed itself on me as I wrote and tried to rewrite and find a way to ease the reader into this life, just as many of you found that you were eased into your life here in Hamilton by your first drive, your airplane, however you got here. I wanted to grab that first moment and make it come alive because of the interviews I had with my schoolmates. When I started to write this book, I was not going to write a memoir. It did not occur to me to write a memoir. What I wanted to write was a book very like one called Brothers by Sylvester Monroe. He was a Newsweek reporter. And in the book, he follows the adult lives of a bunch of guys who hung together where he grew up, in a Midwestern town, in a set of, I think it was either one apartment complex or, but they all lived together and hung out. Because he was a student with a better chance, this organization that sent kids off to boarding school, his life took one trajectory. The other guys had other lives. Some had working class jobs, one went to prison, one was dead, and it looks at this group of men. I wanted to do something similar for our group that we called the Third World Society. I wanted to look at these students who were in the first few years of large-scale integration at St. Paul's School, and write a book about all this. And I figured, well, I have one chapter, you know, name one Ed, Jose, Maria, name it after us. What they told me confirmed in me my belief that this experience was indeed worthy of writing about, that it was enough of an experience. It did tell enough about our times to be worthy. Frankly, I mean, it's not enough that we live this, you know, so what? So we went to the school. So we think about it. We have very strong feelings. That's nice, but it's not enough to write about. Unless, in some way or other, these lives illuminate a time. And if I, as a writer, can put it together so that they illuminate a time in a way that creates a beautiful work of art. But the time seemed to make sense. I also learned a lot by talking to these people about many things that we never talked about when we were students together. So, for instance, the story by the guy who looked at the woods and said, oh, now people will be able to jump me and nobody will be able to catch them. The fact that he thought that would have, and since I've written the book, has astonished and stunned traditional students and faculty at the school. It never would have occurred to them that anybody would come onto that campus and feel unsafe. It never occurred to them. So, you know, other things came as I interviewed these people. In fact, it was an extraordinary experience. Again, my husband, sort of looking from the side, said to me, you know, you've gone beyond interviews, and like you're into some sort of psychodrama thing here with these people. Our interviews would start at 9 in the morning and would last all day. I mean, the reason Bob said this was that he would leave for work at 9 and somebody would come in, and at 6 o'clock he'd come home and the man was still sitting there talking. This was like not an interview. This was crazy. We had very intense experiences. Some people said, you have to come home and talk to my parents. This thing, you know, interrupted our lives in such a way, you have to come home and talk to my parents. So I went and I began talking to the parents. They spread over and over. We had to have second, third, fourth interviews. 2 of the 12 people I initially interviewed checked themselves into drug and alcohol rehabilitation centers within 2 weeks of our conversations, because the conversations had so shaken the foundations for them and pointed to them how far they had strayed from their early ambitions. And they said, I've got to get back to where I was. I've got to go at this again. I learned from these how intensely we remembered things. A very important thing for anybody who's about to write a memoir that she doesn't know she's about to write is to learn how the memory, I mean, that's why I put in that little section about my memory as a card shark, you know, playing with the deck. Memory changes things. I sat in one man's house, his parents' apartment, and I'm talking to him about his memory of getting into the school. And he tells me, so I remember when they first sent me the tickets. Tickets came in the mail. Boy, that was something, you know. I opened the envelope, it was like, whoa, I mean, he's going on. He had created this whole Hollywood moment for himself. His mother was around the corner in the kitchen washing collard greens in the sink. His mother said, He said, what was, she said, remember we carried you up there. She said, remember, and then she went through this whole thing, was so perfect, and it's the way people constantly checked each other's memory. She said, remember we borrowed your Uncle so-and-so's car, and we carried you up there? He remembered he got there. He knew he didn't have a car, but he'd forgotten. She said, remember you had to get up there early for football, and we borrowed the uncle's car, and oh, yeah. He said, oh, yeah. Memories. I also learned how incredibly unresolved that time was for most of us in our minds and hearts. One man who had received for 10 years running the award for his school district for excellence as a high school teacher. The man was extraordinary. He was one of those high school teachers that everybody hopes for, who transforms lives. You know, he's exciting the classroom. He's amazing. This man's father said to him, he told me, as I had invited a bunch to lunch, because I also found that what happened is when they talked to each other, bing, 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 they would remember other things. So I started, besides the psychodrama interviews, then I started these social psychodrama interviews where I put 3 of them together, and then they could really fight about all the memories, right? Man, no, that was after, that you weren't in corner that year. That was when you moved to middle. Oh, was that? No, that was after, remember, so I had to look for, so that was great. So I'm stirring lunch. I'm stirring this pot here because he'd come early. And I also found that people came early when they wanted to say something special, right? And he tells me, as I'm cooking this lunch, he said, you know, my father doesn't think that teaching high school is enough. I said, but you're an excellent teacher. He said, yeah, I know what I am. He said, my father says that if he had had my advantages, he'd be president of the effing United States and want to know what's wrong with me. At other times, classmates, I'd ask them a question, they'd say, I'll tell you, but turn off the tape recorder. No, I'll tell you what really happened. So I had this huge pile of material. And I'd been a magazine writer, right? And suddenly I had all of this material, a big old mountain of this material. Some of it was off the record. Some of it, although it was on the record and although these were educated and sophisticated people, the fact was they had told me things that I knew it was wrong to write down because 4 years from now they would not want to see it, or they wouldn't want their kids to see it. So I had to figure out what to do with this stuff, so I put together a book proposal, something. And I sent it to my agent, who called me up to New York and said to me, Lorene, every time you talk about this experience, it's fascinating. And that's really, why I wanted to see this book proposal. But I got to tell you, this book proposal you did right here, this book proposal is really boring. That's a problem, when your agent says it's boring. That's a really big problem, because that means she's not going to sell it to nobody, right? So she came up with some ideas that we couldn't figure out. I said, all right, just please give it back to me, and I'll figure something out. And what I realized, of course, was that I could not tell these people's stories. I was not free to do so. And it became a memoir by necessity because mine was the only story that I felt I had permission to write as I saw it. The other thing was I knew my story from inside and out. And a lot of the story of growing up is an inside job. A lot of it is how what's inside communicates with, influences, is influenced by what's outside. And I needed to be able to do that. And the reason you write a book rather than doing a movie is because you want an interiority. You want the inside, the interior sense, right? So that explains why it's a book. Explains why it's a book, why it's a memoir. It also, the other thing was that I wanted to make sure that this story was not a prep school version of Topsy, who just grew. I wanted to make really clear that I came from someplace, and that where I came from was as important as where I went to. I was very afraid of that because I knew good and well, people sometimes say, well, if you'd stayed at public school, would you have become a writer? Probably so, but I wouldn't have had a subject that New York editors would have cared about in a memoir subject. And I knew, for instance, that when I'd sent up my early drafts, some of the notes had come back to me saying, one note was really quite telling, where someone had written on you should cut the reference to the limousines. Well, there were no limousines. They'd read the limousines into the story. There were no limousines in this story. So it said to me that the people who are reading this are interested in and have issues with the wealth of the people with whom I was going to school. So that I had to be very careful to write my own book and not write a book that was going to be the tool of someone else's envy, right? Figure out a way to tell this story. When I finished the book, and I also went up to my editor and I said, I don't know what to put in. This is very scary to write. It's my first book. It's my first advance. You know how they pay you, right? They give you half the money to start, like you pay a carpenter or a plumber, half to start, half to finish. So they gave me half to start. But now think about this. You get, if your folks got their money for the whole year, half at the beginning, and then half at the end. Now I have to write the thing for which they've paid me, advanced me half the money. So it was kind of scary to go up and tell them, I don't know what I'm doing. Knowing that, that it was legally within his right to say, why don't you give that money back? But I did anyway. I got on my little black dress and I went up to New York and I said, I'm just not sure what I feel like. I'm going down the rabbit hole. And what my editor said to me was, write it all down and then edit later. But get it all down. So I began that process of bringing more and more of the mountain in, of reading old letters, reading all the publications from the school at the time, writing drafts, sending them out, talking to people, what do you remember, continuing my interviews. One of the things that happened to me in that process was I talked to John Buxton, who is in the book. By this time, this English teacher was an administrator, and I taught with him. We'd been colleagues. I went up and for 5 days in the summertime, I talked to all the teachers I could find. And essentially what I really wanted to know was this. Was I just paranoid, or did you not expect of us the same excellence that you expected from our traditional student colleagues? Did you not expect excellence from us? And what I got from these people who had taught me, who had been my colleagues, were very honest and tortured looks where several of them said, look, the fact is, Lorene, when you guys first came up here, we didn't know what to expect. And I know that sounds terrible, but we didn't know what to expect. And it verified for me all the times I heard from my peers, their anger when somebody came out and said, and guess who got the high honors today? Rodriguez. Why is that so surprising? Rodriguez got the high honor. So, we weren't nuts. We weren't just too sensitive. We were, maybe picking up on something that was. So I went there to ask those things. And at the end, having been trained as a reporter and done newspapers and magazines, I ask the question you always ask at the end of the interview, which is, what have I forgotten to ask you? What don't I know that I should? What don't I have? I don't have the wit to ask you. What should I know? And John Buxton said to me, you know, there was something that happened to you in the middle of your first year. I don't know what it was, but you came in, you know, with that, yeah, I'm from Philly, you know, you can't tell me nothing. He said, you know, you had that sort of cocky thing. And then, like, in the middle of winter term, it just, whew, like something sort of knocked the steam out of you. I said, thanks, John. Thanks very much. And I went outside, and I didn't know what he was talking about, but I kept, you know, when you turn, you just felt like something was here, and I sat down on the discipline bench, which was outside his office, because I needed to sit. I knew it was something. What I remembered was the first sexual experience that I had for real, forgotten for 15 years. Completely forgotten. Like the river in Egypt, denial, I had forgotten it. It was gone. Didn't exist. And I thought, oh yeah, so had some consequences that the adults were noticing. Woo. And went back home trying to figure out what to do with that. In fact, what that moment did was it turned this memoir thing from the story of a black girl going to an upper-class white school, a girl going to a boys' school, whatever. It changed it from that into a girl grows up. It was at that moment that this became a coming of age. And when a friend whose parents are both writers said to me, well, you don't have to publish that story, but you do have to write it, because the way you know things is to write them. So you have to understand what it meant to you. And then you can decide whether to put it in or not. It was part of what Henry James would have called, had he seen it, the phrase he used for the Russian novels. It was part of the loose and baggy monster that was the first draft of Black Eyes, a 500-page manuscript that I sent to my hapless editor, who had told me, write it all down. That's what he got for saying that. 500 pages. You know, 500 pages, a first book from, you know, an unknown, it was just outrageous. But I needed to get it all down. The day afterwards, now those of you who have read the book, you know that I was a little hyped on work, sort of a little hyped. That continued into my adulthood. Okay, so the day after I sent the book in, I didn't work. It was a big deal. I took a day off. Nothing, I did nothing. Nothing, no house, no cleaning, no cook, nothing. Dropped the 3-year-old off at daycare, walked the dog. All day, nothing else. Down by the river, my dog likes to run, catch rats. I mean, we hunted that day. We did urban hunting. If anyone's interested, I'll tell you about the breed. They're very good. And no muss, no fuss. They're good around children, and they do the job. However, so the dog and I are walking, and then I put her back on the leash, bring her back into this park. And it's the park that I've always gone to with my kids. It's got swings, it's got I always go there. With the child who was then 3, I went 4 times a week, no less. In it is a man I've never seen before. And he's sitting on a bench, and he says to me as I walk by, I like your t-shirt. You know, let's not even go there, okay? Let's not, because I'm on a day off and I'm feeling real good, and I don't need to talk to you about t-shirts or anything. And then I realized, however, I had on a t-shirt that said, Black by popular demand, Howard University. So he was making a Howard University reference. I said, I get it. My brother-in-law gave me this t-shirt, blah. And he talks, he said he taught at Howard, etc. Then he says to me, so when you're not walking your dog up and down the river, what do you do? And I said, I'm a writer. Oh, you want to be a writer? How nice. I said, I don't want to be a writer, sir. I am a writer. Oh, really? What did you write recently? So I said, well, funny enough, yesterday I sent in a book. Now, the other thing is, I don't usually talk to people. I live in a city. I don't spill my guts about I just wrote a book. It's usually, keep on going. I found myself talking to this older gentleman about the book and all this stuff, and I put in, it was probably the sound of his voice and his accent that I said, and I put in my great-grandfather's stories from Barbados, and he said, did you put in skin? I said, yes, sir. Did you put in this? Did you do that? I said, yes. And then I said to him, what the thing I'm afraid of is that I'm afraid that they're going to try to take that stuff out, that all they want is the St. Paul stuff, and that they're going to take out the other stuff. And he said, but whose book is it? I said, it's my book. He said, so we'll write it so they can't take it out. I thought, okay, right? So I got to write it. I got to bring it from 500 down to 300. And the deal is now I have to own it so that it becomes not just a memoir, but I decide what the story is. Because you can edit it down to be any one of many stories. And it's not just going to be about some girl goes to a white boarding school and ta-da, they make her into somebody. That's a colonial book. That's a colonization of one's own head. So figure out how to tell your own story. What is it? And that's what the first draft hadn't done. It wasn't just, therefore, my integration into this school that was important, but what Ralph Ellison calls the more important integration, which is the integration of our own personality. It was what we all have to do, which is how do I take this education and use it? How do I make it part of me without pulling my own personality apart? It's what every student, every legacy, every scholarship, every full pay, every nouveau riche, every student does. What do I do with this legacy? In figuring out, it meant that I had to understand, rediscover, talk to other people, and learn about the process for me of growing through this experience. Now I'm very sorry that I did not learn the last name of Riedel, with whom I had dinner. So I could refer to him by last name, not just a first, like, faculty anonymous here. But we were talking at dinner, and a very, very important question: when do you begin to understand the effect of this education? And for me, it was a long process in understanding that culminated to a large extent in the writing of it. Draft after draft after draft. I did about 3 main drafts all the way through. But I found that this process was full of conflict. Full of conflict. Not predictable conflict. And conflict that I had to negotiate given my individual temperament, my training in my family, my emotional training, as well as my social and political training that all of us get in our lives and families. What I learned in the writing of the book that I hadn't realized before was there was not one right way to respond to what felt like a monolithic stimulus. That is the feeling in institutions, some of them very like this. The feeling that they are leaning on one to assimilate, to come closer and closer to an acceptable norm, and pushing, as in that section that Steve Orvis read, as if to sort of push and push to get. So you sort of start over there, and then you get pushed over. You're a little too nationalistic, and then they push that. And then you're a little too noisy, and you're a little too, and they can't do anything about the lips, so it just stays that way. But there's the sense of pushing and pushing and pushing. How close can you get to this other norm? This is the standard. This has always been the standard. It's been the standard since the 19th century. Get closer to it. And it's not just being able to whistle something from Brahms. It takes more than that. Feeling that. But my understanding before had been that there was a right response to this, and I had to be smart enough to get it and figure it out. And I was very hard on myself. All of us were when we didn't do it quite right. I thought it was my right and my duty to respond. I thought it was my duty to build a lifelong action plan of response. And in fact, I still take that on as a choice, however, but realizing now that it is a choice. I think your generation has helped me to understand that in some ways. But the other thing I understood was that each different temperament is going to respond differently. We understand that in other situations. We understand that's true in sports. We know some people are going to be more aggressive, we understand that in emotional situations, we understand that. But not when we're talking about race and class and ethnicity. We think that, and the dominant sort of mainstream group says there's one way to behave. I learned a lot about that by writing a book about the Underground Railroad, where time and time again the more radical abolitionists were sanctioned by their more conservative abolitionist friends saying, stop being ugly, basically. Just be nice, and the people who hold slaves will keep respecting you. But if you get shrill, and if you get ugly, and if you get too violent, if you get too, out of the norm, they're not going to respect you, and then you're going to hurt your cause. Because you've got, and other people writing back saying, we've been nice. It hasn't helped the cause. We've got to have another response here. It was not just my right, but a necessity. I felt it was a necessity because I went to a school that was built on an economic pattern, built in a time that originally rested on an assumption of slave labor, rested on free labor, rested a lot of the money that was made that went into the building of St. Paul's School was made because immigrants were paid less than they ought to have been, was made because we had an economic structure that allowed the making of large profits. I sat in those buildings. I took in the privilege of them. I took in the history and culture. It was important for me to acknowledge that I therefore was a recipient of that privilege, and at the same time, a protester of it. And I had to integrate that into my own personality. Color was no longer cast, but I had to acknowledge that people of color must still deal with the residue of stigma, just as white Americans enjoy the residue of racial privilege. And that we have to figure that out. Some people have talked about, asked me questions about my old friends back at school. What I had to do was acknowledge, in order to keep those friendships, that this school had picked me up off one track. The track I was on, I was going to public school, I was going to be made into a good taxpayer, I was going to have a perfectly okay job. I was getting an education that had been formed for 19th century industrial workers. Line up, girls on this side, boys on this side, everybody wait. If you can't wait quietly, we can't do this at all. Please. It was about waiting, it was about getting in line, it was about following directions, it was about, this is a beautiful, beautiful drawing, but you didn't do it in the line, so you get a C. That's what it was about. It was not about find another way, become a leader, change the world. What would you like? What can you imagine? Let's figure out how to get it. It was not about that. I was picked up off one and put onto another track. Completely. I was taken off this road, there's a sort of traffic thing, and put onto this highway. Highway. I mean, people were going fast on this place, right? Decide that they want to see, they're really interested in India, they have some relation to it. So we find a tutor. We find a tutor to teach somebody, Hindi for 3 years and then figure out ways to get them over there? Extraordinary. I was the inheritor of that privilege. It has made me arrogant in the way that my peers were arrogant. So that when I realized as a writer going from town to town that I was always in settings like this one and never in inner city settings doing just this, it made me say, where can I get $250,000 to start an organization to bring fabulous African American and Black artists, writers, musicians to do what I'm doing, do it in the inner city. So that I did, in fact, start Art Sanctuary in 1990. I didn't start with $250,000, that's what it costs now. I started with $5,000. But to bring really fine people, so that we've had Nikki Giovanni and the Roots and John Edgar Wideman and opera singers and classical pianists right there in a church in the middle of North Philadelphia. I wouldn't have thought that way had this thing not happened in my education. We inherit our DNA. We breathe in molecules that other people have breathed in and breathed out. We also inherit the economic system. We inherit the challenges of it, as well as some of the possibilities for transforming it, I believe. I don't want to go much farther because it's really terrible to invite a writer and have them like not stop talking. That's really bad. And I know, I've been there. I've been to these lectures and the writer is reading and they love their own words and you just think, oh, Jean, for God's sake, stop her. But I do just want to end with this. Growth toward wholeness, I think, integrating this privilege into one's life partly means accepting a greater responsibility. This privilege, you know, often we in America, we don't look at what we have. We look at, you know, what somebody 50 grand above us has, and we say, I don't have that, right? I know, I went to Hamilton College, but I mean, we never had summers in Switzerland, you know. So we do that instead of saying, right, you know, so I've got this privilege and let me ante up responsibility. All of this is happening in a country where the lives of 1/3 of young Black men your age are in some way restricted by the criminal justice system. It's happening in that context. It's happening in the context of a country where a large minority of children grow up in poverty. It's happening in a country where, just as the 80s and 90s stock boom concentrated wealth, we are also concentrating poverty and hyper-segregation, creating a greater marginality of the inner city. The sense of a larger community informs the anger and anxiety, the often inarticulate rage and frustration of students who are not down with things as they are, because though they love the privilege, they also see the ways that the privilege is implicated in oppressing others. There is room in our system for that protest. There is room, and because there always has been room, there also has been and will continue to be change. That gives me enormous hope, and that's one of the things that that very education taught me. It's the possibility of change and the incredible power of individuals. I'd like to end with a short reading from the end of Black Ice. St. Paul's gave me new words into which I must translate the old, but St. Paul's would keep me inside my black skin, that fine, fine membrane that was meant to hold in my blood, but not bind up my soul. The stories show me the way out. I must tell my daughter that. I must do it so she'll know. Then I can go to my own room where the window is open to the black night and fly out unafraid to meet the darkness. I can fly out at dark, to rub against the open sky. And ain't I a woman? I must leave my mother and father. I must leave my husband and daughter sleeping. They will come too if they want. The night can carry us all. It is big enough. Others are there already, calling, welcoming. At dawn I will alight on my sill. I can slip into my smooth skin. It will welcome me. I will stay within it most nights and sleep next to my husband, but I will return again and again to the sky. The skin will grow wrinkled as the nights come and go, but my husband will not salt it. My skin will know me, and I will not have to fear my skin. Thanks.
Questions, I think. There's a microphone in the middle back there. Or closer to your comment. Donnie, you might.
It's okay. It's all right with me. If some people need to leave, you can leave now, but others of you who have questions, we can wait just a moment until you sort of gather them. But you've got to have some questions. So I'm willing to wait for a moment. Please. How did I remember in such detail? And you're probably too polite to ask, did I make stuff up? No. How did I remember in such detail? Here's the fact. I wrote the book for 3 years, right? 3 years, and you heard the process. A lot of interviewing, a lot of jogging of memory, a lot of asking people, this is what I remember, what do you remember, how did it sound, that kind of stuff. I read everything that was published in the school during those years. I looked at photographs. I also asked my family for my letters back. I did not keep good journals. I kept journals of trauma. I'm only a journal writer of when I'm in deep dismay. I write journals. But nice days I don't write journals. So the news I got from letters because I realized I didn't have time for both. And I wrote very detailed letters because I was so afraid of being out of touch with my family. And incredibly, when I asked them if they had them, they pulled them out, wrapped up in ribbons, arranged chronologically. It was really quite beautiful. So I was able to see, so that, for instance, there's this whole thing about Vernon Jordan coming and Archibald Cox, who's a special prosecutor, and Vernon Jordan. And the difference, in my mind, I'd always linked the two of them, that they showed me different things about visions of what adulthood, powerful adulthood could look like. And then I saw a letter, Dear Nana and Papa, guess what happened this week? First, so-and-so came. Then so-and-so came and said, oh, they were in the same week. And there was a date, February 7, 1971, or whatever it was, too. So that helped a lot. Now, the dialogue I put in, I use dialogue from specific conversations that I remember. The other thing is I'm a writer. This is what I do. I observe, and I store stuff away, and I memorize stuff. I used to like to memorize passages from the Bible. I like to memorize. I like to memorize moments. When I go to schools like this, I try to remember names. It's a discipline for me that I came to when I was a kid. I used to try to look at something and just keep it. Why? Because my great-grandfather was blind, and I thought, writers are morbid people. And I thought, one day I might be blind. Maybe I can, I'll have lots of things to look at in my head if I remember, So, but the conversations I wrote down were conversations that were particularly important to me for some reason. And I only quoted people whose rhythm, whose idiom I felt I could conjure up very easily for myself. So Jimmy, for instance. We talk so much, I can still hear his voice instantly. In other cases where I couldn't really hear the voice and didn't feel like I could mimic it, I paraphrased. Although in some cases I would run a conversation and say, does this sound right? And often they would correct me. There's a scene where Alma, my future roommate, where Alma and I met when we first came up for the interview. I remember that because Alma would not say she liked the school. So here I'm coming up, there's a teacher who asks a student, do you like the school? And Alma says, like? Oh, I don't know if I use the word like, you know. I respected that so much. And that was part of what made me want to go. Here's a school where somebody will stand up and say this to a teacher. I mean, because in our school we would have said, you know, without. But I loved that she was engaged, and so I asked her about the scene. She said to me, I never said I liked that school. And the other thing I found out was that how my own memory would change things. I had that scene with us at the top of this long path down and her at the bottom. And she said, no, Ray, look, I was at the top because I just finished lunch, I remember. And it was like lunch, and I couldn't stay because I'd finished my first lunch and I had a class. And you guys were at the bottom because I remember seeing, and suddenly the whole memory flipped. Why had I changed it? Because I felt a great deal of shame at that moment. Because I didn't know how, in God's name, we were going to get up this icy walkway, right? And I knew my mother had made me wear a skirt instead of pants. She was there. My mother does not go down by herself, you know? And she would slip. And I was going to go down. And then my dad was going to, you know, all 20 years of training, you know, black belt in judo, and he was going to go, you know, why has God put me here with these people? Why? So that was, and I was covering all that up for myself. And the easiest way was for us to be at the top and Alan to be at the bottom. But so I learned a lot. That's how I got the details.
Where did you go to write this book? Where did this all take place?
Where did I go to write it? I was writing on the third floor front room of my house. I have a 3-story row house in Philadelphia. And I was in the third floor front, which was sort of an office for us. Now my younger daughter has a bedroom there, and my computer is a laptop on a tiny little desk by the front window. Because our family has grown to take up all the space. But I wrote up there. With our first computer we ever bought, and a printer that was so slow, and I thought this was a big deal that I didn't have to type it. When I printed it out, it took all day to print those 500 pages. And I had to stand there and nurse it to make sure the pages didn't go sideways off the front. Yeah. And that wasn't that, I mean, it was only like, what was that? 91. It's not like this is in the Kennedy administration. In the back, a young woman with a red shirt. Mm-hmm.
And one thing I find about is that honestly, I was never negatively aware of my color as so look. Even though I've been in class for American, and American general, but Hamilton, you are negatively aware of your color. And I want to know what you think maybe the difference for that. At Hamilton, you're in a family like class institution, just by telling you, I mean, but I was wondering if you experienced that, any negative affirmation from not in your color at the boarding school and then in your college experience.
Yeah, I think different institutions have wildly different collective temperaments. just the culture of the schools is so different. I think if I had felt all fine with St. Paul's School, I would never have sat up in my third floor, 15 years later writing about it. What I found most difficult was the unspoken assumption of inferiority. However it came, that's what galled me most. And it didn't have to be spoken for me to feel it. So I think that's part of what I was trying to understand and create a book that allows the reader to walk through it with me. When I got to University of Penn, my experience is not of any use to you because it was a mess. It was a mess, and so I'm not a great Penn analyst because I was in my own little swivet about our family life. My folks broke up, and I worked 40 hours a week. I was just sort of grinding through. And Penn was huge. I mean, I wanted a big school. I did not want a school where everybody knew me from behind, like 60 yards away. Hey, Lib! I wanted 40,000 people, and I didn't want to know anybody, and that's what I got. And so much so that I found in my later years, I did exactly what Penn is always trying to encourage students to do, which is find smaller communities within the university. And I found it by tutoring. I sub-matriculated into the graduate program early. I did all kinds of stuff to get into smaller groups and break it down after having worked so hard to get a big school, But there it was we just argued much more, and it was clear it was out in the open, and I felt more capable of dealing with anything that came down negative. Please. Oh, sorry, thank you. I'll do her first, and then I'll come up. Yes, thanks.
What sort of reaction did you receive from the alumni association and the administration at St. Paul's?
It's a very good question. How did St. Paul's respond, or react or respond? Here's what St. Paul's School did. They were very generous with me. They let me do lots of interviews. They were great. My suspicion is, are there any closet Paulies here who aren't telling? My suspicion is that when it came out, it got reviewed in the Times, it got really great reviews from the Post and other things. St. Paul's School therefore said, we have created somebody who is able to think for herself and write a good book. And that's what we want. That's what our job is. So they embraced it, and they were big enough to say, right, so she talked about what she thought was wrong in the school. That's exactly what we want. And that was their official response, for which I was glad. If the Times had said this is an embarrassing book, badly written, poorly thought out, rotten execution, I think they just would have dug a hole and put me in it and just wanted the earth to swallow me. I think it was more important to them that the book be well done, frankly. And that whatever it says that's negative be said thoughtfully and heartfully. I think they also wanted to see, was I doing it with bitterness and a grudge or with an open heart. So they were very good with it. Sir.
Based on your experiences and how far you've come, to what extent do you think it's necessary for an individual to be taken out of whatever context that they're in and placed in another in order for them to fully realize their full potential or for them to fully realize what they're going to become? And to use your own metaphor, to what extent do you think a person must be derailed off of whatever track that they're initially on and put onto another track in order for them to reach a point such as you're doing?
I'll tell you, does everybody hear that? The acoustics are good. No? To what extent do I think, and tell me if I vulgarize this too much in the shortening, to what extent do I think that an individual needs to be removed from his or her own life context and put into another in order to fully achieve potential, or to be derailed, to realize that. The fact is, I don't think that's always I think it depends on the individual. I think it's very fortunate for me that it worked for me. Because certainly we were not, as a family, sophisticated enough about education to make the evaluation that some of my friends from St. Paul's make now. So that my mentor, Ralph Starr, had 5 kids. 3 went to St. Paul's School and 2 did not. Why? Because the other 2, in his opinion, wouldn't have done well there, that it wasn't the right place for them. He knew what it was like, and he knew the character, the temperaments, the educational, emotional, spiritual needs of those children, and made an evaluation. We were not able to make that. There was this opportunity, there was this scholarship, I took it. It never occurred to me to say, well, geez, well, if St. Paul's School wants me, maybe we should research other boarding schools and see if there's one that's a better match for me. In fact, the experience was bruising for some people and just awful. And I think some people really flourish staying with their family supports or in their situation. Or some people, so I don't know that answer, but I don't think it's predictable based on circumstance. I think it has much more to do with the match between the individual and his or her circumstances. Yeah. Who have I consistently missed? Sir?
Yeah, towards the end of the book, you had your school reunion, another class we asked you. Well, you guys were talking about your careers, and he was telling me how you went back to St. Paul's and taught. And he was like, well, why didn't you go to a less advantaged school and you went to town there instead of going back to St. Paul's? You stated how like, you wanted to help as soon as like, you felt like they were going through the same experience you went through. But I just have a question. The question is, do you hope in the future will have you taught in an institution that is like less advantaged as St. Paul's or I'm sorry, which college are you teaching at?
Penn. Right. Yeah, the question for those in the back is, at the end of the book, one of my classmates asks why I chose to go to St. Paul's School, which has so much. Why not go and teach at a place that has fewer advantages and to spread the wealth, in other words, right? And have I, or do I intend to in the future, teach at places that are less advantaged? I have done. When I was at Penn, when I first came to Penn, which has only been about 6 or 7 years, I made a personal commitment to teach an hour in some community activity for every hour I taught at Penn. So I taught lots of places and lots of kind of wacky programs, a rite of passage program for kids, an after-school program, a drug rehab. So I did lots of that stuff. What I realized at the end of 4 or 5 years was this: I'm a writer, really. I always teach on the side, but the center of what I do best is writing. I work very hard at teaching, but I know it's not natural in the way that writing is natural to me. So, given that one only has but so much energy, and that I now have 2 children and 1 adopted child and a dog, and my husband was in seminary and all this kind of stuff, I need to use my energy as well as I can. Part of the reason I started Art Sanctuary was because I realized that I could do that sort of one-to-one thing forever and not leverage what I do. It wasn't enough. So because of Art Sanctuary now, what I've done is taken what I love, this art, put it in a church in North Philadelphia. And we now run lots of really fine artists. In other words, more than just me, much bigger than me. Through a place, we have educational programs. We have drumming lessons for the kids in the after-school program. We have painting lessons. We've got this teaching deal where I teach kids at Penn the works of a black writer. They go out and teach his works at 10 scattered sites, and then those 150 people all come to the reading. So I'm trying to do more than just say, okay, I'm going to teach. I taught at St. Paul's School for a year. This is not a whole career. If I were teaching for a career, it would be different. I also know there are advantages at large and fancy universities, and teaching at Penn allows me to do things that I wouldn't be able to do if I took my half-time teaching and put it somewhere else. So what I hope to do always is just leverage it, is use that to do more. That's just my take on it. It's not the right take, that's a take on it, and that's how I do it. Yes, please. Loud, would you stand up and do it loudly, please? There's a mic right there. Nobody will use the mic. You're too cool? Everybody's too cool for the mic? Oh, come on. Nobody can hear you. You're going to do it? Oh, thank you.
Is it working? How do you feel, or like, have you ever had specific instances where readers have dissected your novel and maybe come away with different points than ones that you had intended to make? Like, have people ever done that, and how do you feel about that?
Have I what?
How do you react to that, and how do you feel about that?
Well, at first I was just stunned, but now it's fine. It's just fine. Because here's the fact. I write a book and then I give it up. It's over. It's like nail clippings. It's done. It was alive. It was me. It was part of me. Now it's not. So take it, interpret it, figure it out. And I had to do that, otherwise I would stop writing. Because if you keep trying to control it when it's in other people's heads, you'll make yourself nuts. So all I can control are exactly what words I put on the page. And I have to work and figure that out and do the best I can. And then it's gone. It's gone. You know, when they first published this, they published 7,500 copies. I did not expect to be here 10 years later talking to you guys about this thing. I just hoped, please God, let them sell that 7,500 copies so that I can write another book. Because I knew if they only sold 3,000, they'd never give me another contract. And that was the extent of my ambition. It's not great, but that's the truth. So now I learn more and more. I learned things. I went out on my first book tour and people said, oh, I couldn't put this down. I read it in one sitting. I thought, 3 years I worked? Or people also, you know, when they first started studying it, they would send me 20 different papers that students had written. And besides the fact that the correspondence from such a thing will kill one, I also realized that people just do like I do with a book. You take it and you make use of it intellectually and emotionally. And that's fine. That's what it's for. So I need to just step back from it. And a little bit of time has elapsed, so it's better with me. It's hard when it first comes out, because I'm still close to it and I'm still kind of raw about it. But as long as I'm writing another book, it's okay. Now, I say that because I've never had a book, and I can be so sanguine about this, because I've never had a book that's been really used or manipulated. And I would feel differently had I had that experience of trying to do one thing and finding that, you know, it's a complete opposite. I did for a while get a lot of phone calls from newspaper reporters who wanted the view of somebody, of a black conservative. Why was that? It's because they read the blurbs. They said, black, went to prep school, she must be a black conservative. They never read the book. I mean, they weren't interested. They were just looking for a soundbite. But the only person who's going to be changed, whom I know will be changed by the book in the way I want that person to be changed, is me. And that was a rude, rude awakening I got when I wrote Black Eyes. And I've just had to accept that and move on. Yeah? Yes, please. You're not using the mic either. Nobody's using it. See, she was so good. She was so good.
When you arrived at St. Paul's School, in what way had you expected to turn it out and change it?
I really wanted to influence. I wanted to make it. I wanted to make it a place that valued what we now call multicultural life. That's what and the other thing is I wanted to do really excellent work and make sure that there would be room for other people coming behind me, and not have that work hidden. That's the turning it out is supposed to be obvious, but not just for its own sake, but partly so that other people would come behind and wouldn't be first anymore. Other people would come behind and people wouldn't be so surprised that they wrote a great essay. That's, yeah. I'm trying to get somebody, yes?
I'm going to throw a question back to you that you asked your people you were interviewing. Other than your story through Black Ice and what you told us here, are there things that you feel that are left out that you would like to share with us, or you wish you tell other? Oh, no, this is my microphone now. Are there stories that you wish to tell us, or other lectures that you go to? I have a friend that went to St. Paul's, and I asked him what his reaction to reading your book was, and he said, yeah, there are a lot of underground stuff that you include in the book, but there's also a lot of other stuff that you didn't really include. But.
Yeah, there is a lot of other underground stuff I did include in the book, partly because I didn't live it. So I got one letter back. The two really negative letters I got from anybody at St. Paul's School, one was from a guy who said, it wasn't all negative, he just said, you never really showed the serious drug scene. He said, you did that one thing of the hash, but you didn't show the serious drug scene. And I wrote back and I said, Lonnie, I didn't do serious drugs. That's the point. I didn't, that was it. That was what I did. That was enough for me. Similarly, I didn't write about, the Switzerland crowd, or I wrote what was necessary to tell my story. So there is a lot that I left out, but that's because I didn't participate in it. Some other things that I left out, what I try not to do, and this is similar to my response, it feels like a non-answer, but the fact is that I write, and I've got to do what I got to do to keep writing the best I can. And some questions that readers have or that critics have are useful for readers and critics, but will completely block, constipate, stop, kill one from writing. So I can't stay. I do a lot of stuff like, in Black Beauty, where they say they take the horse and they cover its eyes, and the horse will go through the burning building as long as its eyes are closed, but otherwise it'll just panic and kill everybody. I did a Black Beauty meditation every morning when I went to write this book, because there were so many things I could do that would stop me and scare me. So I would just say, okay, just today, all you're going to do is just chapter 3. That's all you're going to think about. You're not going to think about anybody else. You're not going to think about anything else. So one of the things I do now that I've already published, I cannot worry about what I didn't put in the last book. I only use it to teach me what I need to do the next book better. So in Price of a Child, there were many narrative issues that I don't think I did well enough. I use them as I think about narrative in Pride. I use them as I think about the narrative in Blackface. But I can't sit, and worry about the fact that I introduced too many people all in the first chapter in Price of a Child, and nobody can remember who the hell's who. I know that. It's not nice. So, yes, there are a few things. One thing, but the fact that I left them out, there may be psychically you do what you do for a reason, right? So I've got to accept that too. I left out something, and now I'm appalled. When I was teaching at St. Paul's School, I went up to the faculty room and looked through some of the old books one night. I don't know why. Like I didn't have enough to do, right? Chapel, teaching, coaching, like I was reading that. But I was in the faculty room and I looked at these old books. And I saw some of my teachers in a play. And in this play, they had blackface. You had what on your face? I couldn't believe it. Now, I wrote the whole book. I forgot about that incident. Okay, so now I'm writing a book called Blackface. I think I saved it. You know, as a writer, I said you squirrel things away. I think I saved it. I think it was just too big for that. But I should have put it in. You know, I should have put it in. So, you know, if you worry about that, every time I finish a book, I look up and I say, once again, I've done a whole book, and I'm not Tolstoy, and I'm not Baldwin. Once again. And people say, oh, you must be so proud. I'm not. I'm pissed off. And you know, so as a writer, you negotiate with your own perfectionism and figure a way to keep doing so you can do better next time. That's what I try to do. How are we doing?